Before the first light touched the windows, breakfast was already decided. By what was left in the pot from last night, by what the grease crock held, by whether the bread had gone stale enough to do something useful with. No one drove anywhere, no one opened a box. You worked with what was there, and what was there had to hold you through the milking, the feeding, the hauling, and everything else the day lined up before noon. Some of these breakfasts will look strange to you now. One of them, near the end, may surprise you even if you grew up on a farm. Stay at the table. Number 11, fried cornmeal. Mush. Nobody called it a breakfast food. It was the pot from supper. Cornmeal cooked in salted water or milk until it thickened, poured into a pan, and left to cool overnight. In the morning it came out cold and firm, sliced into slabs, and laid into a cast iron skillet with a spoonful of lard. What came out was something else entirely. The outside turned stiff and gold, the interior stayed soft and faintly sweet, and the whole thing smelled of cornmeal and hot grease in a way that still makes a cold kitchen feel warmer than it is. In 1950s farm households across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and further into Appalachia, this was a weekday staple, not a special occasion, not a recipe anyone wrote down, just the sensible use of what was already made. You can order polenta in restaurants now for prices that would have confused my grandmother. It is the same idea. We just did not wait for a chef to discover it. The dish started disappearing when packaged cereals made hot porridge feel like extra work, and when people stopped making it nightly, there was nothing left to fry in the morning. In many Amish kitchens, cornmeal mush at supper is still ordinary, which means the cold slab in the pan the next morning is ordinary too. We were not being clever, we were being careful, but cornmeal mush was not the only leftover that found a second life in the skillet. Number 10. Pan-fried cold oatmeal. You would not think yesterday's oatmeal could become something worth waking up for. Most people today throw it away without a thought, but cooked rolled oats, left overnight in a pan and chilled until firm, slice cleanly and fry the same way mush does. Golden at the edges, chewy soft in the center, slightly nutty from butter or bacon grease, a little crisp where it pressed against the iron. Served with a pour of sorghum or a spoonful of apple butter, this was a fast morning meal that needed nothing new from the pantry. The work was already done. You were just finishing it. Instant oatmeal ended this, not because the food was inferior, but because it made a large pot of cooked oats seem unnecessary. One packet, one serving, nothing left over. The technique only works with real oats cooked properly and in quantity. Where large batches are still made, in households feeding 8 or 10 before the barn, the cold slab in the morning still gets its turn in the skillet. It was not a lesser breakfast. It was the same breakfast, made smarter. Some poor man breakfasts did not come from last night at all. They came from whatever the pantry managed to hold through winter. Number 9. Bread and milk. Stale bread was not garbage in our kitchen. It was tomorrow's meal. Tear it into an enamel bowl, pour warm sweetened milk over it, add a pinch of salt or a little butter, and you had something that looked plain but held a child through a cold morning better than most things a box ever promised. Some families called it panada, some called it milk toast, some called it nothing at all. It was just bread and milk, and the name was beside the point. It was soft enough for small children and older grandparents alike. It used milk the farm produced and bread that would have otherwise molded before morning. It cost almost nothing. French onion soup uses the same logic. Stale bread rescued by liquid. Except the poor man's version needed no oven, no cheese, no hour of preparation, just a pot on the stove and whatever bread had been sitting under the cloth since Tuesday. When Wonder Bread became common, stale bread became embarrassing. The soft sandwich loaves of the late 1950s went stale faster and reheated worse than homemade. By the time convenience bread was the standard, the habit of using old bread had already started to feel like a sign of not having enough rather than a sign of knowing what you had. In homes where bread is still baked in large weekly batches, the stale bowl still shows up on cold mornings. A bowl of warm bread and milk does not photograph well. It does not need to. Convenience did not only replace cooking, it replaced knowing what yesterday's food could still become. The difference between a careful kitchen and a wasteful one was not money, it was memory. Bread did not end at supper, oatmeal did not end at breakfast, grease did not end when the sausage was gone. Number 8. Potato cakes from leftover mashed potatoes. Before anyone stepped into the barn, the leftover potatoes were already in the skillet. Mashed potatoes from the evening before, cold and stiff, shaped into patties with your hands, sometimes with an egg pressed in to hold them together, sometimes with a little flour, always with salt, and fried in lard or bacon grease until the outside crackled and turned a dark, almost caramel gold. The center stayed soft and hot. You pressed them with a spatula, and the crust gave a sound that meant they were ready. This was a meal that happened because nothing was wasted, not because anyone planned a breakfast menu. Boxed potato pancake mix exists now and costs a few dollars, but it is made from dehydrated flakes and produces something thinner and blander than what a cast iron skillet does with real mashed potatoes that have been resting overnight. The texture is different, the crust is different, the morning is different. Once instant mashed potatoes made large pots of real mashed potatoes feel like extra effort. The morning after cakes had no raw material to come from. In large households where supper still produces a heavy pot of potatoes, the morning skillet still gets its patties. Nobody planned potato cakes for breakfast. They happened because nothing was wasted. Potatoes could anchor a morning, but some mornings, the anchor was a piece of meat nobody would recognize today. Number 7. Scrapple. If a visitor called this a strange breakfast, it told you something about what they had never had to do with a hog. Scrapple is pork scraps, the head meat, the trimmings, the pieces that could not be cured or smoked, boiled with broth and cornmeal or buckwheat, seasoned with black pepper, sage, and sometimes thyme, poured into a loaf pan and set until cold. It slices thin. It fries until the outside turns dark and almost crisp. The sage smell fills the kitchen before the rest of the household is fully awake. This was a butchering day food, Pennsylvania Dutch in origin, carried through generations in communities where a hog's value was measured by how little was left over. A winter staple when ham was too costly for every morning, Scrapple provided protein, warmth, and a use for parts that otherwise would have been buried. With eggs or a pour of apple butter, the plate could carry a working man until midday. Commercial Scrapple exists and always has, but by the 1960s it had quietly moved away from organ content toward standardized pork trim. The version on the 1950s farm was more varied and more honest. It was not a food invented to be exotic. It was invented so nothing would be thrown away. Scrapple came from butchering day, but there were poor man breakfasts built from something even simpler. 1 egg and whatever the pantry offered. Number 6. Egg in a hole. We did not have one name for this. Every family had their own. What we had in common was that it used 1 piece of bread and 1 egg and left nothing behind. A hole torn or cut from the center of a slice, the bread laid in butter or lard, the egg cracked straight into the gap, the bread crisped and soaked fat at the edges while the egg set in the middle, the small torn piece fried alongside as a dipper. The yolk stayed soft if you watched it. The whole thing was ready before the coffee finished. This has appeared in brunch menus as something clever. It was not invented clever. It was the fastest possible use of 1 egg on a cold weekday morning when the child had to leave for school and the hen had only laid what she laid. Nobody photographed this for a cookbook. It was just Tuesday. People who look at these meals and think too heavy, too greasy, too much are measuring a farm morning against a desk chair. The body doing the milking before sunrise and the hauling before noon is not the same body sitting in a car by 8 o'clock. The food was not excess. It was fuel, measured to the work. Number 5. Buckwheat pancakes with sorghum molasses. The modern version uses half buckwheat and half white flour and calls itself rustic. The version many farm families made was darker, sourer, and needed nothing to apologize for. Buckwheat grows in poor soil and was milled locally in much of central Pennsylvania and parts of Ohio well into the 20th century. The batter was started the night before, flour, sourdough starter or yeast, buttermilk or sour milk, and left covered on the counter until morning. What came off the griddle was almost black, dense, earthy, with a faint sourness that white flour pancakes cannot reproduce. Sorghum molasses, not maple syrup, was what went on top in most poor farm households. Maple syrup was expensive and came from somewhere else. Sorghum was local, cheap, and mineral. It coats the tongue differently, less sweet, slightly bitter at the back. The two together, dark cake and dark syrup, was a breakfast that could hold a hired hand through a full morning. White flour became cheap enough to replace buckwheat for everyday use. Local mills ground less buckwheat as demand fell. Sorghum molasses disappeared from most commercial shelves outside the South, and the overnight batter, the planning ahead required before modern households standardized instant mixes, simply stopped fitting the morning. A buckwheat pancake made with white flour is a different food. The name survived, the taste did not. Number 4, bacon grease toast. The grease crock sat beside the stove every morning, not because anyone was careless, because grease was an ingredient, the same as butter, the same as lard. After bacon or sausage was cooked, the fat left in the pan was poured into the crock and kept. Bread laid in that hot fat came out dark and salty and faintly smoky at the surface. Spread cold on a slice and eaten fast before the barn, it was dense, fatty, and completely without decoration. Avocado toast sells for $9 now, and people cite the fat content as a virtue. Bacon grease toast was dismissed from respectable kitchens in the 1970s for the same reason it worked in the 1950s. Health warnings about animal fat arrived, the grease crock came off the counter, and vegetable oil replaced rendered pork fat for a generation that no longer raised its own pigs. In households where lard is still a pantry staple and where the hog's fat is rendered at home, the crock beside the stove is still there. The grease crock did not disappear because the food was bad. It disappeared because people were told to be embarrassed by it. What these breakfasts required was not a recipe. It was habit, the kind built from watching the same hands do the same things before sunrise, year after year. Write that on a card and see how much it teaches. Number 3, cornbread and buttermilk. This was not a cooked breakfast. It was a glass, a spoon, and whatever was left in last night's cornbread pan. Crumble the cold bread into a bowl, pour buttermilk over it cold, add a pinch of salt if you liked, and eat it standing or sitting before the stove was even lit. The cornbread absorbed the buttermilk quickly and became something between cold porridge and dense cereal, slightly grainy, faintly sour, filling in a way that plain food is filling when the body is genuinely hungry. Buttermilk was a byproduct of churning, which meant it was a constant in households that churned regularly. It was not a specialty ingredient. It was what the churn left behind. The family with a churn had buttermilk to drink, to cook with, to pour cold over leftover cornbread before the fire had caught on a dark morning. Commercial buttermilk became a baking-only purchase and ceased to feel like a daily drink. Cornbread itself became less common outside the South. The cold bowl without any cooking required felt, by the 1970s, like not quite enough, even when it was exactly enough. It asked nothing of you. It only asked that you had not thrown away last night's pan. A jar of apple butter opened in January was September's work remembered. The breakfast that used it was not nostalgia, it was planning made visible. Number 2, apple butter on homemade bread with coffee. My mother never bought apple butter. The idea would have made her laugh. She made it in October, out of doors, in a heavy kettle, with whatever the orchard had given and whatever the wind had already brought down. Bruised apples, wind-fallen apples, apples too small to sell. Hours of stirring, cinnamon, cloves, allspice, apple cider reducing down until the whole mixture turned the color of dark mahogany. Poured into jars while still hot, sealed, and carried to the cellar. From November through March, that apple butter sat on the breakfast table every single morning. Spread thick on a slice of homemade bread with a cup of strong black coffee. It was a poor man's sweet breakfast. Not fancy, not expensive, costing only what the orchard grew and what the labor of an October afternoon produced. The smell of a jar opened in winter is cinnamon and cooked fruit and something slightly smoky from long hours of reduction, and it carries the whole season with it. Apple butter survived. You can buy it in shops near Amish country now for prices that would astonish anyone who ever stirred a kettle from breakfast to supper. But the autumn kettle, the shared neighborhood labor, the stacks of jars lined up in the cellar, the rationing of them through February, those did not survive. You can buy a jar now, but you cannot buy October. Number 1. Fried eggs in bacon grease with bread for sopping. This was not a recipe, it was the morning. If the grease was hot and the eggs were from that morning's gathering and the bread was yesterday's, there was nothing left to decide. 2 or 3 eggs cracked into a cast iron skillet already holding saved bacon drippings. Not butter, not oil, not something poured from a bottle. The grease popped and smoked slightly at the edges. The whites set fast and developed a faint crust at the border. The yolks stayed soft. The grease worked into the whites in a way that butter cannot, giving them a depth that is smoky and savory and completely plain. The bread went in last, pressed against the pan while the plate was still being set, soaking up what the eggs left behind, coming away dark at the edges with absorbed fat. Nothing remained in the pan that needed washing away. The whole meal was finished in 7 minutes and eaten in less before the barn door opened. This breakfast did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the world it belonged to disappeared with it. The pre-dawn kitchen, the farm, the large household, the grease crock kept beside the stove, the hens that laid each morning, the bread baked 2 days before and kept under a cloth, the physical labor that made every calorie in that pan necessary rather than excessive. The dish is still simple. The morning that required it is nearly gone. In households where the eggs are gathered before breakfast and the bread was baked on Wednesday and the grease crock sits where it always sat, this is still the morning. We did not eat it because it was traditional. We ate it because the work was already waiting. 11 breakfasts. Not one of them was fashionable. Every one of them performed a job. The job changed, and for most kitchens, the breakfast changed with it. What stayed were the kitchens where the job did not change, where mornings still begin before the light, where the pan is already warm, where yesterday's food is not waste, but the beginning of tomorrow's meal. If your mother or your grandmother made something on this list, or something like it, with a different name or no name at all, leave it in the comments. Tell me what she called it. Tell me what it tasted like. Some of the best recipes were never written down, and the people who carried them are not always still here to ask. The skillet cools on the stove. The bread sits under its cloth. The chair at the end of the table is empty, but the kitchen remembers.